Jesus was in the temple one day, sitting opposite the treasury where people brought their tithes. He saw many rich people putting large sums of money in the treasury. It was quite the display. They didn't have offering envelopes with numbers keyed to your name so that you could give anonymously, or checks that could be folded over so no one could read the amount. This was quite the public display, as the coins, paper money hadn't been invented yet, clanged into the large jars situated in the temple treasury. A rich person could kind of humble brag about his wealth by doing a long, slow pour into the jars, and everybody could ooh and ah as more and more coins were deposited. Since the amount you were required to deposit was a straight up 10% for everyone, this was no progressive tax system, one could do a rough estimate of a man's wealth by watching closely to this display. Wealth was a sign of God's pleasure and blessing, and those who were particularly wealthy and pious would kick in a little extra, even in some cases 2 or 3 tithes. You know someone is wealthy when they can afford to pay 20 to 30% of their wealth and still have more than 99% of the people have. Besides, it was going to come back to them anyway. Some of the ones watching were the temple leaders, including some of the high priest's lieutenants. For particularly wealthy and influential men, the high priest himself would be on hand to witness the piety of the wealthy and to personally thank them for fulfilling their obligation plus some. The high priest was arguably the most powerful Israelite in first century Judea. Even King Herod had to reckon with them. Through the years, high priests and kings vied for the position of most powerful Jew. Herod the Great undoubtedly held the title during his reign, but when he died, Caesar Augustus respected the terms of his will that his 3 sons divide the territory of his tetrarchy among them. Herod Archelaus ruled over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. This is the Herod during Jesus' trial. But you notice that in the Gospels, Pilate dealt with the temple leadership rather than Archelaus. One indication of his weakness and irrelevance. Augustus, soon after Jesus' death, removed Archelaus for his incompetence. So, yeah, the high priest was the man. So, by impressing him, the wealthy were going to get certain favors that probably even exceeded their tithes. They viewed their tithes not so much as obligations, but as investments. Of course, if tithing in a public treasury was an opportunity to display one's wealth, it cut the other way too. For the poor, it was one more humiliation in a lifetime of humiliations that poverty always brings. The poor got no credit for bringing their tithe to the temple. If wealth was a sign of God's pleasure and blessing, then poverty was a sign of God's displeasure and scorn, all on public display. Of course, one's poverty is always on display, but when you live among the poor, it's not so bad. Everybody's in the same boat. But can you imagine having to take the long trek to Jerusalem, uphill all the way, and then climbing the steps into the temple, making your way into the treasury, and there in the midst of all the wealthy people and the temple leadership, pay your tithe, which takes all of 2 seconds because you don't have much to give. It was like having a sign around your neck. God hates me. God takes no pleasure in me. God is punishing me. And God forbid that the high priest was there that day watching everything. It was truly an exercise in humiliation. This reminds me of something that happened weekly when I was in the 6th grade. I had a blast in 6th grade, which back in the day was still in elementary school, not middle school. But I was next to my best friend all year and became good friends with another guy that I would go on and play basketball with for the next few years. And we all really liked our teacher, and she really seemed to enjoy herself with us. And she was really good friends with the other 6th grade teacher in the room next door. And so they set up a friendly competition between the 2 classes. Each Friday, we had a spelling test. Both classes used the same list of words, and the competition was whose class could do better. Both teachers kept a large shopping bag of cheap candy, peppermints, butterscotch, Jolly Ranchers, that kind of stuff, the kind you can buy in bulk. And whichever class won the spelling competition, each student from that class would get a piece of candy from the losing teacher's bag. Someone from the losing class would have to take the bag and make the walk of shame next door and carry it around to each of the pupils. So this was a big deal. We'd all take the test at the same time, and after everyone had turned in their papers, we would gather around our teacher's desk and watch as she graded each paper. And there would be a collective groan for each X she marked on an incorrectly spelled word. Now, for me, this was great because I've always been a really good speller. Pretty much never studied for a spelling test. I mean, we'd drill each other the day before on the spelling words, but I had always done a lot of reading, and I just knew what a word looked like. I could see it in my head, and I'd just spell what I saw. So I rarely missed more than a word or two out of 20. I also rarely got them right because, remember, I never studied. Just a few minutes of studying would have done the job, but I could never be bothered. Besides, I always got an A, so having the whole class watch my paper get graded was always pretty cool. But there were other kids who needed to study but didn't, and they'd get 5, 6, 7 wrong, something like that. But there were a couple of kids, one girl in particular that I remember. She couldn't spell worth anything. I don't remember her name. I remember she kind of had short, dark hair, and I remember her desk was up front close to the teacher. And I remember that she would never gather around the teacher's desk and watch the grading. She would just sit at her desk looking miserable because she couldn't spell. I mean, teacher would come to her paper and we'd all hold our collective breaths, hoping that maybe this week she would have studied and her test wouldn't be a complete disaster. And each week she would disappoint us. She would sit there in complete humiliation as the teacher would make X after X on her paper, enduring the groans that the rest of us would make with each one. It actually got to the point where we'd almost cheer when she got one right. And so because of her and one or two like her, we almost never won the spelling contest. Maybe 3 or 4 times the whole year. Through some miracle, we'd eke out a win and we'd get to eat some of the other classes' candy, but mostly not. And all because she couldn't spell. And of course, looking back on it, she obviously had some kind of reading issue, probably dyslexia, back before educators really knew about such things. I'm sure my teacher didn't know what was going on, and I'm sure she felt terrible whenever she did learn what was going on, and remembered how humiliating this friendly competition was for that one student. And I'm sure she and the other teacher thought that this would be a way to motivate us all to study and to learn our spelling words. And I'm also sure that little girl did study, at least at first. I mean, anything to avoid the weekly humiliation. And then after a while, she probably stopped studying because it didn't help. I mean, she was as bad after having studied as she was without studying, so why even try? She just couldn't do it. And there was really only one conclusion that she could come to. She was dumb, stupid, because smart people do well when they study, and sometimes even when they don't. But dumb kids don't ever do well, even when they try their hardest. And she was dumb. And even worse, being dumb wasn't something she did to herself. It wasn't a matter of laziness or indifference or meanness. It was just what she was. She didn't do it to herself, so God made her this way. I hope one day she learned that she wasn't actually dumb, that she was just dyslexic or whatever. I hope one day she learned that it wasn't her fault. It wasn't a fault at all, just something to overcome. And I hope she didn't learn it too late, after her image of herself as just being dumb was ingrained in her subconscious. So Jesus is watching this spectacle of tithe giving going on, and he watches as a poor widow comes in and quietly, hoping no one will notice, drops 2 small coins into the jar, 2 small half-pennies. They're so small they hardly make a sound when she drops them in. And nobody's paying any attention to her, and yet they're watching her every move. I mean, the poor are used to that, being ignored and scrutinized at the same time. Scrutinized and criticized. Scrutinized in order to be criticized. Most of our depictions of her have her as a woman in her 70s or 80s, even though neither Mark nor Luke say that she is an elderly person, just that she's poor and she's a widow. But in those days, men married off their daughters as soon as they could start bearing children, which was their sole purpose. A girl was expected to marry by age 20, whereas a man had until age 24. And most people didn't make it to their 70s. It's entirely possible this woman was, to our mind, quite young when she became a widow, maybe even in her 30s. But to be a widow with no one in your husband's family to take you in marriage is to guarantee poverty. Poverty and sexual exploitation. So this widow comes in, and no one wonders if she's a widow because someone sinned. It was just accepted as fact. And she's poor because of sin. There's something in her that displeases God. It's obvious and unquestioned. Now, the way I was always taught this story is as an example of true generosity. While the rich were generous with their abundance, she was generous with what she needed to live, to survive. And thus, we should tithe even when things are tight and then trust God like this woman was doing. But that assumes that a tithe, or any giving to the temple, is a completely personal and individual choice between you and God, which is what it is for us. But in ancient Israel, a tithe wasn't voluntary. It was a tax. You had to give it. I don't know that Israel had an IRS service to make sure that you paid your tithe, but they had other ways of enforcing it. So it's not about generosity. I mean, do you feel you're being generous when you pay your taxes? You may feel that you're being taxed too much. I mean, who doesn't? But you pay out of obligation. You pay out of fear of consequences, but you are motivated by generosity because generosity connotes choice, and you don't have a choice. This woman is not there by choice. She's not there out of any altruistic feeling of generosity. She's there out of obedience. She's there out of obligation. She's there because of a system that taxes the poor at the same rate as the rich, that forces people to take money that they literally need to eat and to give it to an already bloated institution that hands out blessings to those who can already afford to be blessed, while doing nothing, providing no safety net for people like this poor widow, who not only needs to keep her 2 small coins, but needs someone to value her life enough to come alongside her and help her just to survive. But she doesn't get that. They take her 2 coins and they humiliate her while doing it. Jesus is watching all of this, and he calls his disciples together for a teachable moment. Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. I need you to understand what is going on here. Jesus is not lauding her generosity. He's denouncing a system that is geared towards taking from the poor what little they have, while taking from the wealthy only what they can already afford to give, and then rewarding them on the back end with all kinds of favors and entitlements. You hear a lot about entitlements these days. Well, not just these days, going back for, at least FDR and the social programs that he put in place during the Depression. But the difference between the way we talk about entitlements and the way that Jesus talked about them is we talk about them as something that the poor get, they feel they deserve, but don't really. That entitlements are a burden on the rest of us tax-paying citizens who don't get any entitlements. So we need to stop giving entitlements to the poor. They don't deserve them. I mean, am I wrong? Is that not the attitude in our culture? Whereas the wealthy don't get any entitlements, and yet we keep wanting to take from their hard-earned pot of gold and give it to those who don't deserve it and aren't grateful for it. I mean, does that not capture the viewpoint of the world? And yet, Jesus does the exact opposite. Look closer at this. Just before this widow comes into the treasury, listen to what Jesus was telling his disciples. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." If this isn't a picture of entitlement, I don't know what is. Walking around in long flowing robes instead of the simple utilitarian robes of the everyday person. They expect respect. They demand respect. They feel it is their right to be respected. The best seats are always reserved for them. And at banquets, not only are they invited, they expect that they'll be seated with the host. If there's a big banquet and they aren't invited, they're indignant. If they show up and have to sit at the back by the kitchen door, they're indignant. They'd rather leave than suffer such indignity. So let me ask you this, just speculate for a second. When these guys receive an invitation to a banquet given by an important person, you think they feel grateful? No. They're supposed to be invited. They've earned it. Their station in life entitles them to such things. But do you think they feel it's an entitlement? No, they've earned it. Do you think they feel grateful to be invited to sit with the host? No way. It's their rightful place. They deserve to sit with the host. See, this story isn't just about hypocrisy and pride as people normally talk about this passage. This passage is about injustice. It's impossible to feel gratitude when you feel entitled to something. You may say, thank you, but that's not really gratitude. That's just being polite. Entitlement comes from an oversized view of your own accomplishments. And by oversized, what I mean is thinking you deserve something because you and only you worked for it and you earned it. But none of us do a thing without others contributing to our success. I mean, sure, I could spell because I could see the words in my head because I had seen them often enough in the books that I read. But that at that point in my life, I had never bought a single book for myself. I learned to read in public schools financed by everyone in my community, and my mother never once, not one time, ever refused to buy me a book when I asked her to, even when things were a little tight in the household. And I never paid a dime for my college education. That was paid for by my father, who pinched pennies and saved so that my brothers and I could go to college. My father, who worked his way through Mississippi Southern University and finished in 3 years so he wouldn't have to finance a 4th year. And my father was only able to do that because his father didn't insist that he stay and work on the farm. He didn't insist that any of my dad's brothers or sisters stay home and work the farm the way his father had insisted that he quit teacher's college and come home and work the farm. And I've no doubt that having no kids left to help him work the farm as he got older contributed to my grandfather's early death at just age 62, the same age I am today. And yes, I read the books and I studied enough, but not really that much, but I studied enough to graduate from high school. And I'm the one who took the classes in college and crammed for the test and earned the college degree. And I'm the one who went to grad school and worked my tail off to receive a doctoral degree and all that. But none of that would have been possible had my grandfather not let my father stay in college rather than help him on the farm. And none of it would have been possible had my father not worked for the university while he was attending the university, and had he not been fortunate enough to be a mathematician when the Russians launched Sputnik and set the US and Russia on the space race, in which mathematicians were needed and sought all over the country. And had he not saved for our college so that we didn't have to work in the school cafeteria to pay for tuition. If none of that had happened, I wouldn't be here right now. Whatever success I have had, whatever accomplishments I've achieved, are not mine alone. I share them with my family members who are now dead and family members who are still a part of my family. And I share much of my accomplishments with many of you who have volunteered sacrificially, both your time and given sacrificially of your resources to support this church. And what is true of me is true of each of you and whatever successes and accomplishments you've achieved. And I don't take all this for granted, and I hope you don't either. I hope you are deeply appreciative of the contributions others have made to your life. And I also hope that you don't blame others who didn't grow up with fathers who paid for college and grandfathers who sent their children away while they worked themselves to an early death. Some people are poor widows who are poor and widowed through no fault of their own, just as some little girls had dyslexia in a time when nobody really knew what dyslexia was. What my classmate needed was someone to help her find a way to read and to spell. Someone to tell her she wasn't dumb, just different. And what that poor widow needed was someone to come alongside her who didn't feel entitled to have more than they needed, but grateful to be in that position, so grateful that they would pull 2 small coins out of their abundance and tell her, I got this. Go buy something to eat. In fact, I got that also. You can be poor and generous, and you can be wealthy and generous, but you can't be entitled and generous. The entitled always expect something in return for their generosity. No matter how much the entitled give, it's never an act of generosity. Generosity comes out of true gratitude. It comes out of our recognizing our interconnection with everyone else and our interdependence on everyone else. So on Thursday, when you're thinking about the things that you are grateful for, and I hope you will take some time to think about the things that you are grateful for and not just binge on food and football. When you think of the things that you are grateful for, I pray that it will lead you into a spirit of generosity. Oh, Father, you are the one who is entitled to all good things. Yet your very nature is self-giving. You are sacrificial in your generosity, having withheld not even your own Son for us. And he, though being one with you in creation, having all power and majesty, emptied himself in order to come to us and show us in person what true divine love looks like. As we enter into this Thanksgiving season, may we have the same mind in us. As we gather with friends and family, may we recognize with thanksgiving the connections that we have and the way that each person has contributed to who we are. And let us remember those who have no family to gather with. Remember that they are a part of your family too, which makes them a part of ours. May we be generous with our abundance and gracious with our lack, and always grateful to the one who gives us life, who redeems us from darkness, and who always welcomes us home. In Jesus' name, amen.